Hello, hello. Am I audible? Hello, am I audible? Hello. If you could write on the chat screen if I am audible, I can begin the lecture. Hello. Okay, so I'll begin the lecture now. Okay, a very good morning to all. Today our topic would be DVT and pulmonary thromboembolism. So this is a morning motivation. I hope you all have woken up. So let's begin our topic for today. So the contents of today's lecture would be, we'll be studying some basics of hemostasis. We'll be studying what is thrombus, what is an embolus. Then we'll begin on DVT, pulmonary embolism, and finally end with summary. Okay. So venous thromboembolism can be divided into two things. One, deep venous thrombosis, and second, pulmonary embolism. So now I'll be explaining you each and every term in this slide: thromboembolism, deep venous, pulmonary embolism, everything. So going to little basics. So normal hemostasis is simply defined as a process by which blood clots form at the sites of vascular injury. So basically formation of blood clots at the site of vascular injury is hemostasis. The Robbins gives the definition as a process involving platelets, clotting factors and endothelium that occur at the site of vascular injury and culminates in the formation of a blood clot, which serves to prevent or limit the extent of bleeding. So hemostasis would be formation of the blood clot at the site of vascular injury, and it serves to prevent or limit the extent of bleeding. This is आपका hemostasis. So hemostasis, again, this diagram is from Robbins. Hemostasis is basically divided into four steps. So the first step would be vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction occurs immediately and markedly reduces the flow around the site of injury. So this is the first step, vasoconstriction. The second step is primary hemostasis, whereby a primary platelet plug is formed. So basically, the platelets adhere to each other. They change their shapes, release procoagulant granules like ADP and TXA2. They recruit each other and basically aggregate to form something known as the primary platelet plug. Now, this primary platelet plug is a weak plug, and therefore we need the next step, something called as the secondary hemostasis, to make it further stronger. So in secondary hemostasis, there is release of tissue factor. There is a coagulation cascade, the intrinsic and extrinsic pathway, the whole coagulation cascade that goes on here. The thrombin gets activated. It breaks down the insoluble fibrinogen to soluble fibrin to insoluble fibrin. The fibrin gets polymerized, and therefore the fibrin plug is formed. Now this fibrin plug also further activates the platelets, and with the platelet plug and the fibrin, we have a much stronger secondary hemostatic plug which is formed. So the fourth step is thrombus and the antithrombotic events. So basically this is nothing but clot stabilization and resorption. Basically a more permanent plug is formed. The fibrin plug which is already formed becomes more permanent and more stable. And there's also a release of certain fibrinolytic agents like TPA during this event. So basically the main function of the antithrombotic TPA would be to limit clotting to the site of injury. Basically, we need to limit the clotting to the site of injury, and after the role of the fibrin plug is over, we need to dissolve the fibrin plug. So for that, fibrinolysis is also very important. So we have basically four steps. So one is vasoconstriction, second primary hemostasis, third secondary hemostasis, the coagulation cascade, and fourth the stabilization of the thrombus and the other antithrombotic events. So this slide shows you the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathway. Basically, the common pathway is the factor number 10 is activated. This activated factor 10 converts prothrombin to thrombin. This activated thrombin in turn converts fibrinogen to a fibrin clot. Fibrinogen to a fibrin clot. So this was part of the secondary hemostasis. Further, with the help of factor 13, this fibrin clot gets stabilized and forms a much stronger fibrin plug. Okay, so there's something known as the virtue triad. The virtue triad basically has these factors which promote thrombosis. So we have the endothelial injury, we have abnormal blood flow, and hypercoagulability. So all these factors promote thrombosis either independently or in combination. So endothelial injury can be by various toxins, hypercholesterolemia, inflammation, various metabolic products. Abnormal blood flow could be both stasis of the blood or increased turbulence of the blood. Both of them can lead to thrombosis, and of course hypercoagulability. This can be divided into inherited and acquired. We'll be studying this in detail in the later slides. So basically these three factors are very, very important for increased thrombosis in the body, and this together is known as the virtue triad. So this is a very important slide. Okay, so once the thrombus is formed, what is the fate of this thrombus? So basically, if the patient survives this initial thrombosis, in the subsequent days and weeks, the thrombi undergoes some combination of the following events. The most important being the dissolution of the thrombus. So dissolution is the result of fibrinolysis, which will lead to rapid shrinkage and disappearance of the thrombus. So coming to the fibrinolytic system, so basically this yellow thing is the strand. These are the fibrin clot. We have something known as the plasminogen. This plasminogen gets activated with the help of the tissue plasminogen activator, TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. Once activated, it forms plasmin. Now this plasmin degrades the fibrin clot, forming something known as the fibrin degradation products. So this summary is given here. So basically the plasminogen with the help of tissue plasminogen activator gets converted to plasmin, and this plasmin cuts the fibrin clots and forms fibrin degradation products. A very good example of fibrin degradation products, FDPs, is D-dimers. The relevance of D-dimers we'll be studying later, but here you just remember that the fibrinolytic system is basically comprises of the plasminogen and the plasmin, breaking fibrin clot into FDPs, example D-dimers. So this is the important fate of the thrombus, that the thrombus gets dissolved and rapid shrinkage occurs. The thrombus can also propagate and accumulate additional platelets and fibrin into it and become bigger. And third, a very important phase would be embolization. That is, the thrombi dislodges and travels to other sites in the vasculature. So what exactly is an embolus? An embolus is a detached intravascular solid structure which from its point of origin goes to a distant site, right? So basically it's a detached intravascular solid, liquid or gaseous mass that is carried by the blood from its point of origin to a distant site, where it often causes tissue dysfunction or infarction. Okay, so if the emboli is dislodged from a thrombi, the term would be known as thromboembolism. So a vast majority of emboli are dislodged from the thrombi. This is thromboembolism, but an emboli can also occur without a thrombi. That is, there are some other rare emboli that are composed of fat droplets, nitrogen bubbles, atherosclerotic debris, tumor fragments, bone marrow, or even foreign bodies. So this emboli will travel through the blood until they encounter vessels too small to permit further passage, causing partial or complete vascular occlusion. So the main thing to remember here is that emboli dislodged from a thrombus from its point of origin to a distant site. The term we use is thromboembolism. Now this diagram again from Robbins basically gives us an embolus which arises from the deep venous thrombosis. So a DVT occurring in the lower limbs embolizes, goes upper to the pulmonary artery and gets lodged at the pulmonary artery branch point. This saddle shaped embolus, this is the pulmonary artery and this is the bifurcation. So embolus ho gaya. Okay. So coming back to our topic, which is venous thromboembolism. So we know what is thromboembolism. That is emboli arising from a thrombus, and this occurs in the veins. So this is what we are talking about: venous thromboembolism, divided into DVT, deep venous thrombosis, and pulmonary embolism. Okay. So coming to DVT, which is deep venous thrombosis. So why it is called deep? Basically, venous thrombosis can occur in both the deep venous system and the superficial venous system. So talking about the lower limb veins, we have the deep veins and the superficial veins. The deep veins would be obviously the tibial vein, the popliteal vein, femoral, continuing into the iliac vein. While the superficial venous system consists of the great saphenous vein and the lesser saphenous vein. So we all have studied this in anatomy that the great saphenous vein arises from the middle arch goes behind and joins into the femoral vein via the saphenofemoral junction. While the lesser saphenous vein arises from the lateral arch goes posteriorly and joins the popliteal vein. So the superficial venous system consisting of the lesser saphenous vein and greater saphenous vein. Now this superficial vein and the deep vein are connected by something called perforating veins, right? So also the perforators as well as the deep and superficial venous system consist of valves. These valves are to ensure unidirectional flow, and the unidirectional flow is from the superficial venous system to the deep venous system and from below to upwards. Okay. So if the thrombosis, the venous thrombosis arising in the deep venous system will give us deep venous thrombosis, that is known as DVT, while the venous thrombosis arising in the superficial venous system can result in various things like superficial thrombophlebitis or something known as varicose veins. So we will be limiting ourselves to the to deep venous thrombosis. So deep venous thrombosis again can happen in the lower extremities as well as in the upper extremities. Leg DVT is 10 times more common than upper extremity DVTs. So the lower extremity DVT usually begins in the calf and it will propagate proximally to the popliteal vein, to the femoral vein, and subsequently to the iliac vein, right? But it is most commonly in the calf. While upper extremity DVT is very rare and is often precipitated by placement of pacemakers, by placement of ICDs. ICDs are internal cardiac defibrillators, or some indwelling central venous catheters. And also the likelihood of the upper extremity DVT will increase as the catheter diameter and the number of lumen increase. Okay, so we'll be limiting ourselves to the lower extremity DVT here, which begins in the calf. Okay, so now coming to the risk factors for DVT. So these are the table from Robbins, and it gives us the hypercoagulable states. So the hypercoagulable states can be divided into primary causes and secondary causes. The primary causes are the genetic causes, and the most common genetic cause of DVT or any hypercoagulation would be factor V leading mutation. So factor V is one of the procoagulant factors, and the important thing to remember here is that factor 5 gets deactivated by something known as protein C. So protein C here is an anticoagulant, right? So protein C is an anticoagulant and normally it deactivates factor 5. But in factor 5 mutation, the configuration of the factor 5 molecule changes such that there is resistance to the activity protein C. So the protein C is basically not able to attach to the factor 5 in the factor 5 mutation. So factor 5 mutation will result in an hypercoagulable state because factor 5 would be working more than normal because it is not able to get inhibited by its inhibitor. Other genetic causes would be prothrombin mutation. Of course, the protein C and protein S deficiency. Protein C, protein S, both are anticoagulants. Okay. The secondary causes are acquired causes, and this is more important. And these includes prolonged bed rest and immobilization. So basically, what happens is our lower limb leg muscles act as a pump. Basically, they have a milking action which helps to push the venous blood from below upwards. So basically, they help in venous return. So if the person is in a prolonged bed rest or is immobilized, that milking or the pumping action by the lower limb muscles will not happen, and therefore the venous blood will undergo stasis below, leading to thrombosis. So prolonged bed rest, prolonged immobilization, prolonged hospitalization, even if a person undergoes flight travels a lot, like basically in flights, we tend to be immobilized for a long time and there's a small leg space. So that is also risk factor for DVT. Then myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure. So basically in these things, the venous return would decrease. Atrial fibrillation is a very important cause for thrombosis. That tissue injury like surgery, fracture, burns. Now basically these surgery, fracture, burns, these conditions will obviously make the person immobilized for a long time. And also they have these things directly inside the vascular system. They directly result in increase of tissue factor and procoagulants, and this leads to increase in thrombosis. Cancer is a very important cause, and cancer is basically itself is an inflammatory and a procoagulant state, and even the tumor cells release procoagulants. Prosthetic cardiac valves can act as a nidus for thrombosis formation, DIC, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Also, things like cardiomyopathy, nephrotic syndrome. Pregnancy is a very important risk factor for thrombosis. So basically in pregnancy, again, the pregnant woman tends to be resting on the bed for a long time. Second, because of the abnormal pressure into the inferior vena cava, the venous return is decreased and there is stasis over the lower limbs. And also third, pregnancy is a state of basically it's a hormonal state and especially increased estrogen. And estrogen is a known procoagulant state. So pregnancy and postpartum is a risk for thrombosis. Then oral contraceptive pills, OCPs, are again have estrogen and increase the risk of thrombosis. Then we have sickle cell anemia and of course smoking. So this is a very important slide, and this table is very important to ask history for the patient of pulmonary embolism or DVT. Okay. So coming to the clinical features of DVT, the most common clinical feature would be cramp or leg pain. And there can also be limb swelling, as shown in this image. There can be skin changes and ulcers. So basically in Harrison, there is a table which gives the clinical likelihood. So basically there are some clinical variables and each clinical variable is giving a DVT score of 1. So if the score is 3 or higher, it is more likely the patient to have DVT, and if yes, we will go for further investigation and further diagnostic modalities. So the clinical variables are nothing but the risk factors for DVT like active cancer, paralysis, paresis, recent cast, the patient being bedridden for more than 3 days, major surgery for less than 12 weeks, tenderness along the distribution of deep veins, entire leg swelling, unilateral calf swelling, pitting edema, collateral superficial varicose veins, and alternative diagnosis at least as likely as DVT. So if there is an alternative diagnosis which is at least as likely as DVT, that means in the presence of alternative diagnosis, we give a score of -2. इसमें -2 देना है. We add up all the scores, and if it is 3 or greater than 3, it is very likely that the patient has DVT. So how to confirm DVT? So investigation we will do are the plasma D-dimer levels. As I explained it to you before, the fibrinolytic system will cleave, the plasmin will cleave the fibrin to fibrin degradation products, example D-dimers. So increased D-dimer levels basically means more hypercoagulation, leading to more fibrinolysis. The investigation of choice for DVT would be a duplex scan. So duplex scan basically is a color Doppler plus beam mode ultrasound. So what do we see here is we see a loss of compressibility. So what happens is you take an ultrasound transducer, you do an ultrasound of the lower limbs, and normally in the normal vein, when you put an ultrasound transducer over the vein collapses. The normal vein readily collapses by the ultrasound transducer. So as shown here, the blue ones is a vein, and if you put an ultrasound transducer, it will compress. So this is the normal vein. While in DVT, basically, this is normal, and in DVT, the thrombus itself has some passive distension, and therefore, when you put a transducer, it is not able to compress. So basically, this is before, and in the vein, on compression, the thrombus is still there. So basically, the loss of compressibility, and sometimes you can also directly visualize the thrombus. This is a characteristic of DVT, and this is how you diagnose DVT on the duplex scan, color Doppler plus B mode ultrasound. Okay, so coming to the treatment part, so the main treatment is a surgical treatment. The primary therapy being clot dissolution with pharmacomechanical therapy. So basically what we do is we do something known as catheter directed thrombolysis. We insert a catheter into the vein, and we also have some thrombolytic medication into the catheter, and the clot dissolves. So this is known as pharmacomechanical therapy, right? Okay. So this is the primary therapy. The secondary prevention of the DVT would include anticoagulation or placement of an IVC filter. So anticoagulation is done by warfarin and heparin, and this is an IVC filter. So basically, IVC filter is inserted into the inferior vena cava, and it prevents blood clots from going into the heart. So basically, DVT has a propensity for to embolize into the pulmonary artery, but inferior vena cava is stopping the DVT to cause pulmonary embolism. So this is the secondary prevention. Also, for patients with swelling of legs with acute DVT, below knee graduated compression stockings may be prescribed. So these compression stockings help to promote the muscle pump, as we talked earlier. These are intermittent compression machine, basically used in the wards for patients who are chronically immobilized, and this prevents DVT in the chronic bedridden patients. Okay, so this is the secondary prevention of DVT. Okay, so now coming to pulmonary embolism. So as I told you earlier, embolism can be thrombotic or non-thrombotic, right? The embolism can arise from thrombus or from a non-thrombus thing. So a thrombotic embolism will be known as pulmonary thrombotic embolism, which is the main topic for today. While non-thrombotic pulmonary embolism is also there. For example, fat embolism, if there is a road traffic accident and there is a fracture, and it can lead to fat embolism, air embolism is there, tumor embolism, amniotic fluid embolism, and bone cement embolism. Bone cement embolism is basically if a patient has undergone knee implants or knee surgery, so that the bone cement used in an implant can embolize and go to the heart, causing pulmonary embolism. But if this embolism is from a thrombus, example, a deep venous thrombosis in the lower limbs, it will be called as pulmonary thromboembolism, which is the topic of today. Okay. So basically, pulmonary embolism, the fragmented thrombi from the deep venous thrombosis. The deep venous thrombosis in the lower lanes are carried upwards from the inferior cava into the right side of the heart, and they slam into the pulmonary artery vasculature, right? So the DVT which is present initially in the lower limb can embolize and go upwards from the inferior vena cava, enters the right atrium, the emboli enters the right atrium, comes into the right ventricle, and enters into the pulmonary artery. This is what pulmonary embolism is. Fragmented thrombi from DVT going upwards, dislodging into the pulmonary artery. Now, obviously, depending on the size of embolus, the emboli can occlude the main pulmonary artery. This is the main pulmonary artery. It can occlude the bifurcation, the pulmonary artery bifurcation, and if present here, it will be known as saddle embolus, the gross image of which we already have seen. And or the emboli can pass into the smaller, more distal branching arteries. So depending upon the size, which also determines the severity of the clinical features we'll subsequently be studying. So depending on the size, it can be into the main pulmonary artery. the embolus can dislodge into the bifurcation, and or it can occlude more distal and smaller branching arteries. Okay. So coming to the risk factors, these risk factors are again the same as DVT. The most important risk factor is again DVT, and this slide is again very important. The primary and the secondary causes of hypercoagulable state resulting in pulmonary embolism. In fact, recently, COVID-19 is also a very important risk factor for pulmonary embolism, and it's a procoagulant state. And prophylactic anticoagulants are indicated in COVID-19 to prevent pulmonary embolism. Coming to the pathophysiology, so basically, we'll be studying two pathophysiological consequences in pulmonary embolism. The first would be a respiratory compromise due to the non-perfused, although ventilated segment, and the V by Q ratio approaches infinity. While hemodynamic compromise is due to increased resistance to the pulmonary blood flow caused by embolic obstruction. I'll be explaining each of these things. अभी घबराना बिल्कुल नहीं है. So basically, V by Q ratio approaches infinity. हम physiology में पढ़ते हैं. So what does V and Q mean? So coming back to some physiology. So basically, as I told you earlier, DVT from the lower limbs embolizing from the inferior vena cava, the embolus reaches the right atrium, the right ventricle, and dislodges into the pulmonary artery. So this pulmonary artery is continuing right from here to here. ठीक है, इसको ना वो बना देते हैं. Okay. So we have the pulmonary artery, है ना? Pulmonary artery node is bringing blood, the venous blood, which is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, right? Obviously, pulmonary artery, the inferior vena cava is bringing the entire venous blood from the whole body into the right ventricle, into the pulmonary artery. So this blood is low in oxygen, partial pressure of approximately 40 millimeters of mercury. From this artery, the carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and gets exhaled, right? Oxygen from the alveoli diffuses into the mucous lining, diffuses into the blood, into the RBCs, taken up by the hemoglobin, and therefore, after ventilation, the venous blood of the pulmonary artery gets converted into the arterial blood of the pulmonary vein. So basically, in the pulmonary vein, now we have blood which is low in carbon dioxide but high in oxygen. So the partial pressure can reach up to 100 mm of mercury. 90 to 100 mm of mercury is the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. So basically, the pulmonary artery blood is nothing but the incoming systemic venous blood, which is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. While the pulmonary venous blood is nothing, which pulmonary venous blood ultimately becomes the systemic arterial blood, which is high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. ठीक है, तो ये समझ आ गया. So we have a pulmonary vein, the alveoli, pulmonary capillaries, and the pulmonary artery इधर and pulmonary vein इधर. ठीक है. So what is V and Q? So V is ventilation. It is nothing but the ventilation, nothing but incoming and outgoing of the air to and fro from the alveolus, right? So air moves in, air moves out. This is ventilation. While perfusion is nothing but the incoming blood flow from the pulmonary artery. The amount of blood, the blood flowing from the pulmonary artery going into the pulmonary capillary, this is the perfusion, which is termed as Q. Now, point to be noted is that in pulmonary embolus, if there is a block here, if there is a block in the pulmonary artery, there will be no perfusion. The blood, the venous blood from the pulmonary artery not able to go ahead because of the embolus here. Please note that ventilation is not affected. Ventilation, that is the air moving in and out of the ventilation, in and out of the alveolus, remains as such. The ventilation remains intact, but the perfusion is affected. Why? Because the blood flow is not able to happen. There is a blockage here due to the embolus, and the blood is not able to go ahead. So therefore, the ventilation is good. The ventilation is perfect in pulmonary embolism. The ventilation is perfect, but the perfusion is almost zero. Perfusion is almost zero. Perfusion is almost zero. So if we talk about the V by Q ratio, that is a ventilation by perfusion ratio, since the Q, which is perfusion, is in the denominator, so the V by Q ratio will approach infinity. As simple as that. As simple as that. So इसमें क्या लिखा था हम फिर से पढ़ते हैं. So respiratory compromise due to the non-perfused, although ventilated segment, right? The segment is ventilated but non-perfuse, and V by Q ratio approaches infinity. Why is there is hemodynamic compromise? So as we see, if there is a blockage here, there will be backflow of the blood. The blood, venous blood, will not able to go ahead. If the blood is not able to go ahead, there will be less blood going into the left atrium, less blood going into the left ventricle, and ultimately the cardiac output will suffer and it will decrease. Also, due to back pressure, there will be pressure on the right ventricle, leading to right ventricular ischemia and subsequently right ventricular dysfunction. So pulmonary embolism mein there is right ventricular dysfunction. So in the hemodynamic compromise is due to increased resistance to the pulmonary blood flow caused by the embolic obstruction. Death may also be caused by acute right-sided heart failure. In fact, the most common cause of death of pulmonary embolism is acute right-sided heart failure, also known as acute cor pulmonale. ठीक है, so ये समझ आ गया. Pathophysiological consequences, respiratory compromise है. Respiratory compromise क्यों रहा है? Their ventilation is okay, but perfusion is not okay. Ventilation is okay, but perfusion is not okay, and there is a hemodynamic compromise. Of course, the embolus needs to be big enough to block the main pulmonary trunk or the bifurcation to cause any hemodynamic instability. So if the embolus is present in the distal pulmonary artery or the distal small branches, so it will not cause that much of symptoms. Okay. So coming to the clinical features, the most common symptom of pulmonary embolism would be unexplained breathlessness. Pulmonary embolism is also known as the great masquerader. Why? Because it can mimic various other diseases. It can present as various other symptoms, like it can present as hemoptysis, shortness of breath, chest pain, syncope, or even most importantly, the patient can be asymptomatic. So what we need to do is we need to rule out other lung pathologies before we can make a diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. And that is why we say the most important symptom is unexplained breathlessness, because the breathlessness we are not able to explain. So the most common sign is tachypnea, that is increased respiratory rate. There is tachycardia. Otherwise, usually the respiratory examination normal. So basically, these things are basically if the embolus is small or moderate. So basically, there are three categories. We divide pulmonary embolism into three categories depending on the size of embolus. 70% of the times, the pulmonary embolism is small or moderate. This will have normal hemodynamics and normal right ventricular function. Or it could be a submassive pulmonary embolism, or it could be a massive pulmonary embolism. Massive pulmonary embolism constitutes only the 5% of the cases whereby the embolus is big enough to block either the main trunk, leading to hemodynamic compromise, less cardiac output, leading to a systolic blood pressure less than 90. That is, it presents as shock. Massive pulmonary embolism will have poor tissue perfusion and is present as multiple organ failure. The submassive pulmonary embolism is the case of 25% of cases. Here the patient is hemodynamically stable, but the embolus is big enough to cause right ventricular dysfunction. So we have three categories. The clinical features and are divided into three categories: small, moderate pulmonary embolism, submassive pulmonary embolism, and massive pulmonary embolism. Okay. So since the majority of the cases are small and moderate pulmonary embolism, these clinical features are of the small moderate pulmonary embolism, whereby the only symptom the patient may have is breathlessness and unexplained breathlessness, and most of the other respiratory examination is normal. Okay. So now we have something known as the Wells criteria. So Wells criteria tells about the likelihood of pulmonary embolism. Please note that the Wells criteria is not diagnostic at all. It just tells how likely the patient can have pulmonary embolism. It tells about the pretest probability. So now the term pretest probability you will learn more when you study PSM in the third year. So but chota mota I will tell you, pretest probability is nothing. It's very simply the probability of a disease before we actually perform a diagnostic test. The probability of a disease before actually performing a diagnostic test is the pretest probability. So you have noted I have not abhi tak told you about any investigation or diagnostic modalities. What we are playing here is just with the clinical features and the signs. So based on the clinical features, the Wells criteria tells about the likelihood, tells about the pretest probability, and if this criteria is more than 4, it simply means that it is highly probable that the patient will be having pulmonary thromboembolism. It is not diagnostic, tells about the likelihood of pulmonary embolism. So now coming to the criteria. So basically we have 7 clinical variables on this side and score accordingly, right? So if the patient has signs and symptoms of DVT. As I have explained earlier, the most common risk factor for pulmonary embolism is DVT itself. So if the patient has signs and symptoms of DVT, we'll give a score of 3. If alternative diagnosis is less likely than pulmonary embolism. So basically, as I told you, if there is no alternative diagnosis available, the breathlessness is unexplained. There is no alternative diagnosis. So this makes the patient to have more likely to have pulmonary embolism. So this no alternative diagnosis is also given a score of 3. Then of course we have tachycardia, that is heart rate more than 100 beats per minute. This is a score of 1.5. Immobilization more than 3 days or a surgery within 4 weeks. This is also 1.5. A prior history of pulmonary embolism DVT gives also give a score of 1.5. So there are two variables which have score of 1. That is a history of hemoptysis, that is blood and sputum, a score of 1, and the history of or an ongoing cancer also gives a score of 1. Okay. Now, how to remember this? So there is a mnemonic known as DAMS tip. So this was taught to me by DAMS people. So this is how I remember it. Just say DAMS tip. So we have 7 variables. DAMS tip 3, 3, 1, 1, 1.5 each. What is D? D is signs and symptoms of DVT. What is A? Alternative diagnosis less likely. What is M? M is malignancy, that is cancer. What is S? Sputum. Sputum and blood. So S is basically blood, sputum and blood, which is hemoptysis. T is tachycardia, heart rate more than 100 beats per minute. I is immobilization, and P is prior pulmonary embolism or DVT. So have a very good look at this slide. This is a very important slide, Wells criteria. Yeah. So the Wells criteria giving us the pretest probability, and if the score is more than 4, it basically means that there is a high clinical likelihood of patient having pulmonary embolism. And how do we remember it? By DAMS tip. Okay. Now coming to investigation and diagnostic modalities. So we have something called plasma D-dimers. So plasma D-dimers, as I told you, will rise in the presence of a DVT or pulmonary embolism because of breakdown of fibrin by plasmin. Now the sensitivity of D-dimers is more than 80% for DVT and more than 95% for pulmonary embolism. So what is sensitivity? So basically, sensitivity basically means when we say sensitivity is 95%, basically it means that if we take 100 patients of pulmonary embolism, if we take 100 patients who are pakka diagnosed pulmonary embolism, out of those 100 patients, 95 patients will have high D-dimers. 100 patients of diagnosed pulmonary embolism, 95 patients will definitely have a positive D-dimer test. So this is what sensitivity means. It catches the true positives out of the total diagnosed patients. So that is more than 95% of pulmonary embolism. And also the D-dimer test has something known as high negative predictive value. So what does this mean? So basically it means that if the D-dimer test is negative, it means pakka there is no clot at all. Right. So basically a D-dimer being negative is very, very useful than a D-dimer being positive. Matlab, the D-dimer, if it is negative, we are pakka sure that there is no clot, there is no pulmonary embolism. But if the D-dimer is positive, it can also mean, yes, pulmonary embolism can be present or not present. Why? Because there are many other conditions. There are many other conditions in which the D-dimers are increased. For example, MI, pneumonia, sepsis, cancer, even as simple as post-op state of pregnancy can result in increased D-dimers. Now, in any hospital setting, these conditions are very common to have. So a positive D-dimers is not as useful. It can say, yes, pulmonary embolism can be present or not be present. But if D-dimers are negative, it pakka means there is no clot and pulmonary embolism is not possible at all. Therefore, we say the D-dimers has a very high negative predictive value. It has a very high negative predictive value. A negative result is very, very important for us. So, in conclusion, we conclude that D-dimers rise in the presence of DVT or pulmonary embolism. They have very high sensitivity, more than 95% for pulmonary embolism, and they have very high negative predictive value. False positive can occur. Why? Because there are many other conditions in which D-dimers will increase. Okay, coming to the ECG. Now, the most common ECG finding will be sinus tachycardia. What is sinus tachycardia? Sinus tachycardia is heart rate more than 100. So ECG में कैसे देखते हैं टैकी हार्ट रेट? So basically we see the R interval. This is the R wave. This is the R wave. इसके बीच में we count the number of boxes. So basically 300 divided by the number of big boxes or 1500 divided by the number of small boxes. This will give you the heart rate from the ECG. अब इसमें अगर हम देखें तो RR interval era 1 to approximately 2.5 big boxes. So 300 divided by 2.5, approximately 120 is ECG की heart rate है. So yes, there is sinus tachycardia in this ECG. A very specific finding is something known as S1Q3 T3 pattern. So again, it is very specific. That means that it is not very commonly present. You will not very commonly find S1QT3 pattern in the ECG in the patient with pulmonary embolism. But if present, yes, it will indicate कि हाँ pulmonary embolism हो सकता है. Obviously there are signs of right strain and right ventricular ischemia, which is determined by T wave inversion and in V1 to V4. तो अगर हम S1QT3 को देखें, what is this? So basically we take the limb leads. We have lead 1. This is lead 1, lead 2, lead 3. ठीक है. S1 basically means presence of deep S waves in lead 1, presence of deep S waves in lead 1, and Q3 T3 means we go to lead 3, presence of Q waves in lead 3, and T3 means inverted T waves in lead 3. I hope you know the basics. Basically, जल्दी से मैं बता देता हूँ. The first positive wave is the R wave, right? The first negative wave is the Q wave. The negative wave after the first positive wave is the S wave. ठीक है? The first positive wave is R wave. A first negative wave is the Q wave, while a negative wave after the R wave is the S wave. ठीक है? So basically this is a normal ECG. ठीक है, इसमें heart rate बताओ कितना है? So this is the RR interval 1 2 3, मतलब 1 2 3 4, approximately 3 या 4 boxes हैं. So 300 divided by 4 would be 75. So heart rate is 75, which is lies within the normal range of 60 to 100. So इसमें there is no tachycardia. As you can see, normally S waves are present in lead 1, but they are not as deep. They are not very deep. And in lead 3, there are no Q waves. And the T waves are upright. Normally, the T waves in the same direction of the QRS complex. So this is T waves is in the same direction of the QRS complex. So it is upright there. While in the S1 in the pulmonary embolism, S waves in lead 1. So basically, I should have written deep S waves in lead 1. Lead 1 में deep S waves. And lead 3 में presence of Q waves. देखो यहाँ पर Q waves आ रही है. That is the first negative wave before the S wave. यहाँ पर Q waves नहीं है normal, है ना? And presence of inverted T waves in lead 3. ये lead 3 में inverted T waves है. यहाँ पर देखो positive T waves थी, which are normal. So this is what we use the S1QT3. Deep S waves in lead 1, Q waves in lead 3, and inverted T waves in lead 3. Lead 3. So this is not very this thing important for you people, but I just wanted to show you this S1QT3 pattern, which is a very specific finding of an ECG. ठीक है. Now coming to the chest X-ray. तो इसमें X-ray में क्या दिख रहा है सोचो. हाँ, तो ज्यादा लोड नहीं लेना. This X-ray is normal. So basically, the most common X-ray finding of pulmonary embolism is that the X-ray would be normal. So why do we do in chest X-ray? We are doing an X-ray. It is very important to rule out other causes. So यहाँ पर हम काफी देखेंगे कि most of the investigation in pulmonary embolism are actually normal, and we do most of them we are doing to rule out other causes. ठीक है. So X-ray is essentially normal in pulmonary embolism, and it is important to rule out other causes. But theoretically, there are some related findings in a chest X-ray which can be seen in pulmonary embolism. For the sake of completion, I've included this table. For example, there is oligemia of the lung field, known as the Westermarck sign. There is enlarged pulmonary artery, known as the Pala sign. There can be wedge-shaped opacity present, known as the Hampton's hump. The diaphragm can be elevated, known as the Fleschner sign. Very rarely, there can be a blood-stained pleural effusion present. So these are rare findings on the chest X-ray. But essentially, you have to remember the X-ray would be normal in pulmonary embolism. Coming to the investigation of choice. So the investigation of choice is a contrast enhanced CT scan, that is the CT pulmonary angiography. It is an investigation of choice. Basically, it's a non-invasive investigation and a very good investigation. And if it is negative for pulmonary embolism, it will anyway help you diagnose other cause of the breathlessness the patient is having. So the patient is presenting with an unexplained breathlessness, you do a CT scan. If good, if they can see the embolus, well and good. If not, it will help you diagnose other causes. So एक बार ये भी देखने की कोशिश करते हैं उसमें क्या दिख रहा है. So CT scan basically we see it from below upwards. मतलब imagine करो तुम patient के नीचे हो, you are in between the legs and you're seeing ऊपर. You're seeing ऊपर, ठीक है. So this is the right side, this is the left side, ठीक है. ये जो red labeled है, this is the ascending aorta. The ascending aorta on the right side become the descending aorta on the left side. Okay, so this is the ascending aorta. This is the ascending aorta on the right side. This red one is the descending aorta on the left side. ठीक है. ये देखो यहाँ पर ये वाला सेक्शन लिया है हमने thorax का, जहाँ पर basically ascending aorta होता है and descending aorta होता है. ठीक है. This green arrow tells is the pulmonary artery. This green arrow is the pulmonary artery, and here we can see the bifurcation of the pulmonary artery. And इस bifurcation में ये जो बैठा है, this is the embolus. This is the saddle embolus sitting at the bifurcation of the pulmonary artery. ठीक है. And this is how you diagnose pulmonary embolism on a contrast enhanced CT scan. ठीक है. अगर दिख गया तो बहुत अच्छी बात है, नहीं दिखा तो और भी अच्छी बात है, कोई बात नहीं. ठीक है. So this is the investigation choices, contrast enhanced CT scan. Second line investigation is lung scanning, which is also known as VQ scan. So basically, if the contrast is contraindicated, you can do a lung scanning in the patient. So basically, इसमें क्या करते हैं? We take aggregates of albumin and label them with gamma emitting radionuclide. Albumin में we label them with gamma emitting radionuclide. इस albumin को intravenously inject कर दिया, and this gets trapped in the pulmonary capillary bed. And if there's a perfusion scan defect, there will be no blood flow, and therefore there will be no gamma emitting radionuclide. ठीक है. So this is lung scanning, which is the second line investigation. ठीक है. Echocardiography, again, as I said, echocardiography is mostly normal in a patient with pulmonary embolism. ठीक है. However, echo is a very useful diagnostic tool for detecting conditions that mimic pulmonary embolism. So basically, to rule out other causes which mimic pulmonary embolism, such as acute MI, pericardial tamponade, or aortic dissection. ठीक है. And yes, pulmonary embolism में भी finding होती है. The best known indirect sign of pulmonary embolism is actually something known as McConnell's sign. So what is McConnell's sign? There is hypokinesis of the right ventricular free wall with a normal or in fact hyperkinetic motion of the right ventricular apex. So the right ventricular free wall is affected and there is hypokinesis of the right ventricular free wall. In fact, this is the earliest sign which can you see in a pulmonary embolism and an indirect sign of pulmonary embolism seen on echo. But again, this is not very commonly seen, and normally the echo is normal and it is a diagnostic tool for detecting conditions that is mimicking pulmonary embolism. ठीक है. The gold standard would be an invasive pulmonary angiography. इसमें basically क्या कर रहे हैं? Catheter is inserted into the right side of the heart. You're basically going inside the heart. It is very invasive. The catheter is inserted into the right side of the heart. The dye is directly injected into the pulmonary artery and observed on the fluoroscopy. ठीक है. It's not ये जरूरत नहीं है करने की because we have a very good non-invasive investigation which is CECT. Basically कब करते हैं? It is reserved for patients with technically unsatisfactory chest CTs or for those patients in which anywhere an interventional procedure has been planned, and वो करते करते you can always do a invasive pulmonary angiography. ठीक है. तो इसमें embolus दिख जाता है. ठीक है. So coming to differential diagnosis. So as explained earlier, pulmonary embolism is a great masquerader and the most common symptom is in fact unexplained breathlessness. ठीक है. तो इसमें differential diagnosis होते हैं and we use X-ray, ECG, echo to rule out other causes. ठीक है. So there are many differential diagnoses possible between pneumonia, asthma, COPD, CHF, pericarditis, pleurisy, pneumothorax, acute coronary syndrome, and even anxiety. Anxiety is a very important DD in our emergencies for pulmonary embolism. So basically, a young male or young female coming with breathlessness. The BP is normal, the saturation is normal, the X-ray is normal, the ECG is normal, the echo is normal. So we will obviously think that the patient is nothing but anxious and she's a functional patient. But definitely it is very important here to calculate the Wells criteria. And if there are any risk factors for pulmonary embolism or risk factors for DVT. And if present, the patient should definitely be evaluated for pulmonary embolism. And basically sudden onset dyspnea होता है pulmonary embolism में and उसके भी causes होते हैं. जैसे pneumothorax हो गया, pneumothorax में there will be shifting, pushing of the mediastinum. On auscultation, on percussion, you will have hyporesonant sounds, and X-ray में pneumothorax दिख जाएगा. Foreign body aspiration is also another cause of sudden onset dyspnea. उसमें history would be quite apparent, but now there will be lung collapse, there will be pulling of the mediastinum to that side. Acute pulmonary edema, may on auscultation you will find creps, and X-ray maybe you will find changes of the pulmonary edema. And finally, pulmonary embolism. These are basically four very common causes of sudden onset dyspnea. And again, you need to rule out all these three before you can say that it is pulmonary embolism. Okay. So, what is the approach? So, basically, a young patient coming to you with breathlessness. Most of the things here and there are normal, and basically, it is unexplained breathlessness. So, basically, here you need to apply something known as the Wells criteria. ठीक है? तो Wells criteria एक बार फिर से देख लेते हैं. डैम स्टिप था. तो इसमें क्या था? कि D is the signs and symptom patient having signs and symptoms of DVT. A is alternative diagnosis less likely than P. So now you will understand the significance of A here and why is it being given such a high score of 3. Because an alternative diagnosis less likely than P is very important. The breathlessness is unexplained. ठीक है, alternative diagnosis हमें मिल नहीं रहा. So this very highly indicates towards pulmonary embolism. So D is the signs and symptoms of DVT. A is alternative diagnosis, less likely than pulmonary embolism. These two are giving 3 points. M and S are giving 1 point. That is the malignancy, cancer, and sputum में blood. That is hemoptysis. T is nothing but tachycardia, heart rate more than 100 beats per minute. I is immobilization for more than 3 days, and P is prior history of pulmonary embolism DVT. So once you add these all up, you will get something known as the pulmonary embolism score, the Wells criteria score. And if it is more than 4, it is highly likelihood. The pre-test probability of having pulmonary embolism is very high. ठीक है, so अब क्या करना है? So basically, you suspect pulmonary embolism. The Wells criteria is more than 4. So if Wells criteria is high, more than 4, the pre-test probability is very high. So now if the pre-test probability is high, you do the test. Very simple. The test investigation of choice being a CT pulmonary angiography. Okay. So patient suspected pulmonary embolism, you calculate the Wells criteria. If it is more than 4, you will directly go for the imaging test, that is CT pulmonary angio. But if the Wells criteria is not high, that is if it is 4 or less than 4, the next step would be to do D-dimers. D-dimers हमें याद है, it was a highly sensitive test and it had very high negative predictive value. मतलब अगर negative है, clot पक्का नहीं है. ठीक है. तो फिर when we do a D-dimers and if it is normal, if the D-dimers are negative, that is if they are present in the body in normal levels, it is sufficient to conclude that the patient has no pulmonary embolism. Since it is high, it has high negative predictive value, we can sufficiently say it has no pulmonary embolism and we don't need any imaging test after this. But if the D-dimers are also high, again we will do the imaging test, which is CT pulmonary angio. Okay. So this is the approach of pulmonary embolism. You suspect a patient of pulmonary embolism, you take a good history, take good examination, and you calculate the Wells criteria. If more than 4, you directly go for CT pulmonary angio. If 4 or less than 4, you do D-dimers, and if D-dimers are also high, you again go to the CT pulmonary angio. Okay. So now coming to the treatment part. So the treatment is a little complex. I will try to simplify this for you, but this is not very important for you guys. So basically, the treatment also depends upon we stratify the pulmonary embolism into 3 types. The 3 types I have already taught you. It can be small or moderate pulmonary embolism, the submassive pulmonary embolism, or the massive pulmonary embolism. So basically, if the patient is coming with normotension, that is the BP is normal, the right ventricular is normally functioning, this will be a small pulmonary embolism. So इसमें we will do simply secondary prevention. ठीक है, secondary prevention मैंने आपको DVT में भी पढ़ाया था. So basically secondary prevention में anticoagulation आ गया, IVC filter आ गया. Anticoagulation is mostly done by warfarin combined with heparin, है ना. If the warfarin is contraindicated या फिर warfarin से bleeding हो गई है, we use something called the IVC filter. ठीक है. So this is secondary prevention enough for a small or moderate pulmonary embolism. If the patient is presenting with hypotension, अगर patient is presenting with a very huge hemodynamic compromise, hypotension है, multiple organ failure है, this is massive pulmonary embolism. ठीक है. Massive pulmonary embolism. So basically, obviously, इसमें initial supportive therapy तो देंगी. If the saturation is less than 90%, will give oxygen. Hypotension है तो first NS bolus start करते हैं 500 ml का. If not responding, then we further start dopamine or dopamine for patient of hypertension and pulmonary embolism. ठीक है. The primary therapy for primary therapy for pulmonary embolism would be embolectomy or anticoagulation blood thrombolysis. So we can either refer him to the cardiothoracic surgeon and he can do embolectomy, which can be catheter based or surgical, or we can give anticoagulation blood thrombolysis. Thrombolysis में क्या देंगे हम? टिश्यू प्लाज्मोजेन एक्टिवेटर देते हैं. इसमें RTPA देते हैं, 100 मिलीग्राम डोज होता है ओवर 2 आवर्स. Thrombolysis करना है या फिर embolectomy करना है in massive pulmonary embolism. But if the patient is categorized into submassive pulmonary embolism, that is the PP is normal plus there is right ventricular hypokinesia. ठीक है. Then we can individualize the therapy कि if anticoagulation alone is enough or we need to thrombolyze the patient. इसमें थोड़ा सोचना पड़ता है, थोड़ा डिटेल्ड है. So मोटा मोटा याद रखना है कि 3 types of pulmonary embolism हो गया, small, submassive, massive, and उसके accordingly the treatment is there. ठीक है. Okay. So in fact the more important thing for you to understand the mechanism of warfarin. ठीक है, ये तुम्हारे pharmacology exam में भी आएगा. So the warfarin का mechanism of action is inhibiting vitamin K epoxide. Vitamin K epoxide reductase को inhibit करता है. So इससे क्या होता है कि vitamin K is not able to reduce. So reduced vitamin K is not there, and this vitamin K will not able to activate the gamma glutamyl carboxylase enzyme. The gamma glutamyl carboxylase enzyme very important for carboxylation of the factors. The coagulation factors for the activation need carboxylation. ठीक है. So no vitamin K, therefore no activation of the factors. Now vitamin K is known to activate protein C, protein S, and the factors 2, 7, 9, 10. Please note, protein C and protein S are actually anticoagulants, while factor 2, 7, 9, 10 are coagulants. ठीक है. So once the warfarin inhibits vitamin K, there will be no more further activation of these factors. ठीक है. But you need to note factors which are already there. ठीक है. Factors जो पहले से activated है, they are still there. No new activation of factors occurs. So already activated factors continue working and they will finish according to their half-life. The already activated factors will gradually naturally degrade according to their own half-life. Warfarin ने क्या किया? There is no more further activation of these factors. नई activation नहीं होगी. ठीक है. So now the already activated factors जो हमारे पास ये हैं, the earliest to finish would be the one which will have the shortest half-life. So protein C is actually has the shortest half-life and is the earliest to finish. So protein C लेकिन anticoagulant था. ठीक है. तो therefore protein C anticoagulant कम हो गया, coagulant अभी भी है. So warfarin may initially increase clotting. Warfarin may initially increase clotting. This is very important. Warfarin is an anticoagulant drug, but initially it will increase clotting. And in fact, for rest of the 4 to 5 days, there will be no anticoagulation because these factors are still there and they're gradually degrading, right? So no anticoagulation for the initial days. So for the initial 5 days with warfarin, we have to add another agent. We have to add another agent like heparin for the anticoagulation action. And after 5 days, you can always withdraw heparin and the warfarin can continue. ठीक है. Heparin क्यों दे रहे हैं? Because heparin का direct action होता है, direct thrombin inhibit करता है या फिर 10A factor inhibit करता है, and it will also inhibit the already activated factors. And the warfarin is monitored by prothrombin time and INR. ठीक है. So this slide is very important for you guys. ये तुम्हारे एग्जाम में आएगा. ठीक है. warfarin का रोल था यहाँ पर. ठीक है. So this is the live slide and this is a very important slide and it focuses on the role of heparin for prevention of venous thromboembolism. So prevention is always better than cure, and prevention of venous thromboembolism among hospitalized patients is very important. Some of the methods I've already taught you, like for the use of compression stockings, intermittent machines, early ambulation of patient post-op. These things are very important to prevent DVT. इसमें as you can see, you don't need to know the details of all this, but I'm just so basically in high risk non-orthopedic surgery we're using unfractionated heparin. We use enoxaparin. Enoxaparin is no molecular heparin. In cancer surgeries we also use enoxaparin 40 mg daily. In fact, nowadays in COVID-19, as I've already told you, COVID-19 is a procoagulant state, and to prevent the risk of pulmonary embolism, we actually give enoxaparin 40 mg OD in COVID-19. So this is also for prevention of venous thromboembolism. ठीक है. For any major orthopedic surgery like warfarin, ठीक है, warfarin is monitored with the help of INR, and enoxaparin हो गया. Dalteparin is also a low molecular heparin Fondaparin is a pentasaccharide. Rivaroxaban is a very important drug. So basically, it's an oral 10A inhibitor, rivaroxaban. Dabigatran is an oral thrombin inhibitor, direct thrombin inhibitor, oral. Aspirin TXU2 inhibitor. Intermittent pneumatic compression with or without pharmacological prophylaxis. Then this is it. So prevention of venous thromboembolism is very important. Heparin plays a very important role. Okay. So we have 5 minutes remaining. So we'll quickly summarize what we have learned today. So these are just some important slides I'm showing you. The virtue triad is very important even for your pathology exams. So basically it tells you the factors which promote thrombosis independently or in combination, and this consists of endothelial injury, abnormal blood flow, and hypercoagulability. Okay. This slide is very important, telling you the risk factors of the hypocoagulable states. So basically, primarily we have the primary, it can be primary or secondary. The primary genetic conditions होती हैं, secondary acquired conditions होती हैं, ठीक है? तो इसमें factor V mutation आ गया और इसमें ये सब चीजें हो गई, ठीक है? So the treatment part भी बता दें हमने, तो secondary prevention is very important. Anticoagulation by warfarin, combined with heparin for the initial 5 days, and interferon vena cava is very important. So basically the DVT, deep vein thrombosis, want to embolize in the pulmonary artery, और इसको हमें रोकना है secondary prevention से, ठीक है? Compression stocking हो गई और ये सब हो गया. And finally we have the Wells criteria. Wells criteria is very important and gives us the pretest probability. ठीक है? Mnemonic DAMS tip है. And the approach is very important. If more than 4, you can directly go for imaging test. If less than or equal to 4, you can do D-dimers, and if D-dimers are high, you can do an imaging test. Okay. So now that we come to the end of the lecture, I hope you understood thoda bahut of pulmonary embolism. I will recommend you to go back to Harrison and read the chapter, and samajh aa jayega aasani se. I have simplified things for you. That is not a problem. And if you want the recording of this lecture or the previous lectures that I have taken, this is my blog. You can go to this blog, arunamgarg.blogspot.com, and go to the medicine part, and I have uploaded the lectures there. Thank you so much. I'll be ending the lecture now. Thank you so much.